So actually, we can shut that slide down. One of the joys of retiring from corporate life is that I no longer have PowerPoints, and we won't need it until we're way late in the meeting. So I got the broad charter here of talk about payer stuff. And after I got done with about 100 items on the list, I had decided to pare that down to just 3. And they're totally disparate, but I think we'll have some pretty profound impacts on this whole space of computational medicine, precision genomics. And those 3 are fear of the slippery slope. The second is reimbursement for complexity. And then the third is what I would call post-FDA approval surveillance. So let me just dive right into all 3 of those if I could. The slippery slope, we need to begin that argument or begin that discussion with a couple of definitions of terms that are state of art. You hear a lot about that term off-label being bandied about. And clearly we have an indication for a drug that is FDA approved that's on the label. By law, that's mandated for coverage by any payer in 42 states for commercial and all federal programs. The term off-label is a little more subtle and a little more nuanced. It basically refers to, obviously, use of a drug for an indication for which the FDA just simply hasn't done a review. But the implication is that there is good clinical evidence behind it. And obviously, there are going to be variances of what is good clinical evidence, but by and large, you're looking at the same kinds of standards of evidence that you would have almost at the FDA level. Right? There's a third term of art called off-evidence, which I think is pretty crucial to this discussion. And in off-evidence indications, there might be a great theoretical reason to do something. I think you saw a couple of examples in Howard's slide, for example, a palbociclib for a sarcoma, but there would not be any clinical evidence to support it yet, just a good theory. And that's sort of the subtle area where people get tied up in this area, because there are lots of off-evidence suggestions in genomics, but carriers have a problem in that if they start covering those, they have created a new coverage policy that they can be held to ad infinitum. Payers work in a world that's very heavily regulated, and one of the things that regulators ask for is consistency. So whatever policy you're approaching, if you've done it once, you have now done it for every policyholder that you have. And that's the reason you see people struggling with a definition line between what should we cover and what should we not cover. At United Healthcare, we chose to take care of that problem by delegating it outside the organization. It's a busy world out there on my screen. No, it's okay. Nobody else is seeing that. The one thing that you can notice that we went to was using NCCN as our proxy for what the dividing line was between off-label and off-evidence. If NCCN recommended it, we covered it. If the NCCN experts said, no, the evidence isn't sufficient, we won't recommend it, we did not cover it. Others had different definitions. But clearly there is something that you have to decide where it is. So when we start getting into the areas of for example, a track fusion gene, there's a new drug out, as I think all of you are aware, by the name of I can never say it, larotrectinib. And that particular fusion gene is quite rare, but it was seen in 23 different cancers. And in the trial of that drug for those 23 different cancer types, it was highly effective in all of them. That's a huge argument for getting genetic screening for all cancers to look for targetable mutations. And yet we all know of very good examples, you've heard of several of them in previous talks, where a genetic mutation that is targetable didn't work in one cancer versus another. The argument against doing screening for everybody. So payers are struggling right now with what it is we do. My read is that the price of mutational analysis is coming down so quickly that it's going to be allowed in the near future, but you'll see a very slow progression of payers eventually moving to that point. CMS has started the ball by obviously allowing coverage for stage 4 cancers that are thinking about therapy, but not all private payers have followed, and I think they will be slow to do so, but will eventually get there. Now, there's another confusing point in here, and that is that private payers are also administering plans for private companies who set their own rules. So it's entirely possible that you could go to an Anthem health plan, request an off-evidence drug, and get an approval. Take the same circumstance 3 days later with a different patient and get a denial because the first patient was covered by a private employer who had a more generous definition, whereas the second was covered under commercial insurance law where the definitions would be tighter. But they both look like Anthem when you make the request. And it's not Anthem being duplicitous, it is Anthem having to look to the laws that govern their health plan, and they may be different from patient to patient. It's a confusing world out there, and so that at least in today's world, we're still going to have to make individual requests. They will be applied, but what I see happening in a trend is that genomic sequencing will become more and more acceptable. The difficulty you'll have, even with the sequencing done, is getting the off-evidence approval for the drug. Now, there are two solutions for that. Solution one would be things like Rich Shilsky is already doing with the TAPER trial. If you can organize large trials where you find a mutation for which there is no evidence, but the patient can be enrolled in a trial, that is a win-win for everyone. The payer no longer has to worry about the cost of the drug, which is the major thing that is of concern there. And the payer is obligated by law and actually quite willing by policy to cover all of the routine care. So that clearly would be a win-win solution. And I would argue that the NGS companies that learn how to get, say, 25% of their patients enrolled in trials based on their report. The report is so good that it allows the clinician to understand where the nearest clinical trial is and help them get enrolled. That is a relationship and a partnership that I think payers would welcome, because think about suddenly having 25% of your oncology population on drugs that are being supplied by the manufacturer. They save money, the patient has an opportunity for exciting frontline therapies, and the oncologist has an answer or a solution that's good for the patient. The second thing I would love to see is a proof of concept trial, and it's just a slight modification of the trial that Lincoln showed you just a couple of talks before. It is, let's take everyone and sequence them, and then randomize them to either standard of care. So even with the sequencing, if known drug mutations are there that are already proven with evidence, that's standard of care. But the other group gets care that's directed by the genetic sequencing. And if we can show the same kind of results that Lincoln showed in his other modified trial, I think the game's over. Then it should become standard of care for all patients. But that trial hasn't been completed or hasn't been done. And it would, I think, facilitate a lot of the confusion that we see in the payer community by having some kind of national trial that just say the concept is valid. Okay? That's slippery slope. So the second concept that I want to talk about a little bit is payment for complexity. Unfortunately, right now, sequencing is in the laboratory area. And the unfortunate part about that is laboratory compensation is built on very high volume, inexpensive throughputs, right? So a pathologist might make a penny when a urinalysis or a CBC comes through because they are accountable for that for that particular part of the lab and to make sure that the quality control mechanisms are there, but the payment's lousy. There's such high volume, however, that you're able to make a living through it. But when you talk about interpretation of complex genomic sequences, number one, you usually need a PhD, and number two, yes, there are some cases you can do in 30 minutes to an hour, but we all know there's just as many cases that would take a full day or a day and a half of research. And the payments for those are usually very minimal. They are a fraction of the lab cost, called a technical component. It's a payment system that might have worked 5 decades ago, but needs to be modified. And today we do not have payments for the complexity of interpretation and for non-physician PhD types. So I think that's going to have to change. And that changes, at least in our current world, through the CPT-4 mechanism at the American Medical Association. Codes have to be established. I'm also concerned about the kind of work we've already heard about here, where you're building very complex mathematical models. They need to be validated in trials. That's expensive, and a $50 reimbursement for using those tools isn't going to help. We're going to have to think about pricing mechanisms and how we define complex decision support systems. They need a definition, and then they need payment or some kind of payment for usage if we're going to see this field continue to progress. Trying to wrap it into the overhead of a practice that's getting a standard evaluation and management code or an office visit isn't going to be sufficient. And what that will encourage is lack of use of very important tools. And then finally, I want to get to the third topic, which is post-approval surveillance. One of the data sources that hasn't been talked about in this conference is claims data. We're sitting on huge volumes of data that are actually longitudinal for patients. And if they are integrated into some clinical data and information, could serve as very powerful tools to help us understand the effectiveness and the total cost of care of various regimens. So now I will take the 2 or 3 slides that I had, if I can. So I'm going to show you a year and a half's worth of results for non-small cell lung cancer first-line therapy. And this was data that we presented at the ASCO meeting in the 2017 meeting. It's being updated now and is in press. But the 5 most popular regimens at that time are the ones that you see listed above. And what we did was take clinical information we get in the prior authorization process. What's the stage? What is the line of therapy? What's the histology? What's the performance status of the patient? We're asking the same questions that the NCCN guidelines ask as you proceed through them. That data is captured. It's integrated then with claims data. And the claims data, we can find out, did they really get those drugs and how well did they perform? This is obviously the median duration of therapy for those regimens. And the numbers are relatively small, but there's no statistical significance in either median duration or in the average duration of therapy for any of those 5 regimens. They are essentially the same. When you then look at hospitalization rates, there's slight differences between the regimens. A little bit more toxicity to the middle 2, as you can see. And finally, there's the total cost of care for those regimens, which is the blue represents the total cost of the drug, and the inpatient cost, and the remainder is all costs included, everything. Now, we find in cancer patients on active therapy, only about 3% of costs are not related to the cancer. There is an occasional person in a motor vehicle accident, but it's not very frequent. So you can start to look at some conclusions here and realize that maybe, at least on a value standpoint, we could make some decisions about what's going on. For example, the cisplatin gemcitabine regimen, which was just as effective as its other competitors, can be done for half to 1/4 the cost of the others. And perhaps as a strategy, that may be a more effective regimen to recommend on a formulary. Now, you heard all the caveats in a very good speech from Amy yesterday, and they all exist here. This is not perfect data, but it can help us be directional, and it can help us develop a hypothesis or two about what we might want to do moving forward and what needs to be further tested. This data came from 2015 to mid-year 2016. The next set of data, the immuno-oncology agents began to show up. And you'll see in the published information that perhaps they aren't as exciting as we thought they were. There's no way for a clinician to understand that unless we start systematically doing post-market surveillance like this. And there are multiple organizations that could do that, including Amy's Flatiron, including the larger payers like Anthem or the other Blue Cross organizations. So the point being, think about claims as a tool to integrate into our decision-making process because it gives us a longitudinal record you can't get anywhere else. So I'm going to end with just putting a little bit of this into context. There's a study that came out in 2011 that tracked the progress of 2 things, the average U.S. household income And the second was the amount of money it takes to buy an insurance plan for a family of 4 and pay your out-of-pocket expenses. Today, that number is 60% of U.S. household income. 60. And in a decade, on current trends, if there are no changes, it will take 100% of U.S. household income to buy health care. We're on that track. It won't happen because our economy can't sustain it or tolerate it. So in that context, we've got changes to make, and I'm excited about the opportunity of these tools to at least let us use the expensive medications we have wisely, where they can be very, very effective and not waste those resources on patients where we know it's not going to happen. Thanks.